Hello, this is Dr. Donna Burnett. In this lesson, we will consider food selection. Let's get started. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to describe how the 5 sensory criteria influence food selection, recall the nutritional criteria that play a role in food choices, list several cultural aspects that can affect food intake, compare food choices based on religion, list the psychological and sociological factors contributing to food choices, and evaluate various budgetary concerns that can influence a person's diet. Let's take a look at an introductory video from the Culinary Institute of America.
We taste and smell food because of chemicals present in the food or released by it into the air. These chemicals are sensed by our cells, which signal our brains what we're eating. We perceive what chemicals are in the foods because the olfactory cells in our nasal passage and taste buds on our tongue are coated with proteins called receptors. These proteins protrude from the surface of the cell outwards, where they can interact with chemicals present outside the cells. Each receptor has a very specific shape, a shape so specific that only certain chemicals can interact with it. This interaction is similar to how a lock interacts with a key. If the key fits into the lock, it unlocks. If it does not, the door stays closed. If the chemical fits into the receptor, we perceive that particular characteristic. Sometimes the chemical partially fits into the receptor, and this leads to a partial perception of that characteristic. If the chemical does not fit into the receptor, we don't perceive it. Some people have receptors that will not bind with a specific aroma molecule and therefore cannot sense that aroma. They are said to have a specific anosmia to that particular aroma. The overall flavor experience involves both taste and aroma. Of course, other aspects of psychology and the environment also influence the dining experience, but those are beyond the scope of this discussion. There are taste buds that are specific to sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami on the tongue. It was once thought that specific parts of the tongue were responsible for detecting specific tastes. This tongue map has since been disproven, as receptors for each of the tastes are found all over the tongue's surface. Olfactory cells in our nose have receptors specific to many different types and classes of volatile compounds. The flavor of food is determined by signals sent to the brain from taste buds in the mouth and olfactory cells in the nasal passage. These combined signals are interpreted in the brain as the flavor of the food. As food is chewed, it is broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, allowing more surface area. Tastings dissolve into the saliva, where they can make contact with taste buds on the tongue. Most aroma molecules do not like being dissolved in water, and so evaporate from the food as we chew. These volatile chemicals are inhaled retronasally from the back of the mouth into the nasal passage to come into contact with the olfactory receptors. If this retronasal perception is prevented, like when we hold our nose or have a cold, only the tasting chemicals in the food itself, and not those volatile compounds released by the food into the air, are sensed, giving an incomplete flavor experience. When we smell aromas coming from the kitchen, it is because aroma molecules are being evaporated from the surface of the food into the air. These aromas are lost and are not there to be perceived when eating the food. Aroma molecules will dissolve in fats and alcohol, which are less polar than water, and thus chefs can adjust their cooking techniques to maximize the retention of aroma and flavor compounds. To do this, a chef could choose to use a pressure cooker or cook en papillote or sous vide, which trap aromas inside with the food so that they are not lost and can be enjoyed by the diner.
There has been proposed a sixth taste called oleogustus that would help us to detect rancid fats. It is thought to be a protective mechanism. So food companies work hard to make sure that we don't taste rancid fats. They offer thousands of prepared and packaged foods for us, and there's fierce competition for our food dollar. Food scientists study why people eat, what people eat, and which food characteristics entice customers to choose a brand. There are 5 basic influences for food choice. We look at how the food appears, how it tastes. We consider health, cultural, and religious values, the environment, psychological and social needs, and budgetary concerns. Sensory criteria is at the forefront of food choices. We see the food, we smell it, we touch and taste it, we hear it, snap, crackle, pop, if you remember the Rice Krispies commercial. And these sensory impressions are extremely important in guiding our food preferences. One of the first impressions of foods is derived from their shapes, colors, consistency, serving size, and presence of defects. I say one of the first impressions because you might smell the food from another room before you even see it. Color can be deceiving. It was shown that if reduced fat milk color is improved to make it look more like whole milk, it is often seen as higher in fat, smoother in texture, and more flavorful. Look at the next slide and see what you think. When it comes to odors, there are too many separate odors to name. So researchers will categorize them into groups so that they can study them. Sometimes these classification systems overlap, so they're not distinct in that regard. If you'll notice, in the first category, you see burnt. It's also in the second category. These are just examples of groups. Thinking about odors, we know that most odors are detected at a very low concentration. These volatile molecules, as we learned in the video that we just saw, travel to the olfactory epithelium in the upper part of the nasal cavity. Over time, the ability to distinguish between odors diminishes, and this is called adaptation. Thinking about taste a little bit more, usually taste is the most influential factor in a person's selection of food. Think about your own enjoyment of food. Our taste buds are located primarily on the tongue, but are also found on the mouth palates and in the pharynx. Thinking more about taste, the mechanism of taste, I gave you a preview in the Culinary Institute video. We know that it involves non-volatile and volatile compounds. For the substance to reach the taste bud, it must be dissolved in liquid or saliva. And we know that gustatory cells relay these messages to the brain via one of the cranial nerves. And this translates into the sensation that we call taste. Things that can influence your ability to taste include changes due to age, genetics, and also the degree to which a compound can dissolve. Think right now about sweetened iced tea. If you put the sugar in when the tea is hot and the sugar dissolves completely, it tastes really sweet, right? But what happens if you have unsweetened iced tea that's cold and now you try to add sugar? If it doesn't completely dissolve, you won't taste the sugar as well. And it won't taste as sweet as if you had added the sugar when the tea was hot. We know that there are 6 taste stimuli. It has thought to be 5 until recently. And we've added oleogustus that detects the fatty acid length. Sweetness has to do with the chemical configuration of the molecules. You learn that in food chemistry. Sour taste has to do with the hydrogen ions in the food acids. Bitterness has to do with certain compounds in the foods. Salty from ionized salts. Umami from glutamate. And again, oleogustus from fatty acid length. Genetics will affect taste as well as the temperature of the food or beverage. Consider the difference in baked chicken and chicken salad. The color of the food can affect the taste, the age, sex, and degree of hunger of the taster, the time of day the food is eaten, and the variety and available food choices. I want you to take a moment and look at the beautiful colors, the richness of the colors and the fruits. Let's just appreciate that for a moment. Food without aroma has little flavor. That's because those volatile compounds provide 75 to 95% of the impression of flavor. The texture, the consistency, and the astringency affects food choices. Chemesthesis is the ability to feel a food's chemical properties, which can give the impression of being hot or cold. Let's take, for instance, chili peppers. Let's look at the texture of popcorn. Lastly, we'll talk about hearing. Hearing plays a role in evaluating quality. Think about sizzling, crunching, popping, bubbling, swirling, pouring, squeaking, dripping, exploding, crackling. If you remember the Rice Krispies commercial, Snap, Crackle, Pop, Rice Krispies. Well, if you ate Rice Krispies, you heard snap, crackle, and pop, and you looked forward to those. Consider this lovely bottle of champagne. You pop the cork, you hear the bubbly, you pour it, you see the bubbles, the effervescence, you smell it, the bubbles get in your nose, you taste it, it's fuzzy in your mouth. That's an experience that we expect with champagne. Let's take a look at nutritional criteria involved in food selection. The public has been educated that there is a connection between diet and health, and this has led to new food choices for many people. We know that obesity affects some adult groups more than others, and that there's much money spent on quick fixes. The government has published dietary guidelines for Americans, and this has been coming out of the USDA and the DHHS since 1980. It's published every 5 years. The last edition was published in 2020, so the 2020 to 2025 guidelines have been in effect, and we are waiting for the final version of the 2025 guidelines. Essentially, the dietary guidelines suggest that we follow healthy eating patterns, we focus on nutrient-dense foods, we meet food group needs with nutrient-dense foods and beverages and stay within calorie limits, and we limit foods and beverages that are higher in added sugars, saturated fats, and sodium, and that we limit alcoholic beverages. Overall, to maintain your weight, you want to eat roughly the same amount of calories that your body uses. It's estimated that women need about 1,600 calories per day for maintenance, and men need about 2,400 calories per day. And that would be divided up into 3 meals and 2 snacks. That's the recommendation. Of course, being aware that there are other factors that will affect how many calories people need to consume on a daily basis. You can go to myplate.gov and see a MyPlate plan. And what we have here is a plate that gives you a pictorial demonstration of the 2025 dietary guidelines. Another factor in food selection could potentially be the choice to follow a vegetarian diet. About 3 to 4% of the adult population and about 15% of college students choose a vegetarian diet. There are various kinds of vegetarian diets depending on what you include or exclude from the diet. There are some health benefits by eating a vegetarian diet, which could be lower fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, and animal protein, and higher phytochemicals, fiber, complex carbohydrates, and antioxidants. In general, people are consuming less milk and more poultry, fish, fresh vegetables, and grains. Fat consumption has dropped from 42% in the 60s to 36% in 2018. Again, could that be from public health education? Calories are now listed on menus of larger chains and restaurants. You can go to their websites and look up the calorie value of food items. Also, you'll see it displayed on some menus. Now we come to another category. Consumers are very interested in functional foods, nutraceuticals, supplement intake, and nutrigenomics. And this comes under the heading of complementary and integrative medicine. I have a few slides where I have quoted some journal articles, and I provide the reference for you in each case. And this is to give you a little bit more information about some of the definitions of what we're talking about here. So a functional food is similar in appearance to or may be a conventional food, that's consumed as part of a usual diet is demonstrated to have physiological benefits and or reduce the risk of chronic disease beyond basic nutritional functions. It's a food or beverage that imparts a physiological benefit that enhances overall health, helps prevent or treat a disease or condition, or improves physical or mental performance via an added functional ingredient, processing modification, or biotechnology. Here's some examples: tomatoes that are rich in lycopene, breads that contain plant sterols, and eggs that are enriched with omega-3 fatty acids. A nutraceutical is a product isolated or purified from foods that is generally sold in medicinal forms, not usually associated with food. A nutraceutical is demonstrated to have a physiological benefit or provide protection against chronic disease. Example might be capsules that contain bioflavonoids or gamma-linoleic acid. Here's some more examples. In the health category of cancer risk reduction, some of the functional food examples would be cruciferous vegetables, tomato products, citrus fruits. For heart health, we see dark chocolate, tree nuts, peanuts. For intestinal health maintenance, fermented dairy products. For urinary tract function, we see cranberry juice. So these are examples of functional foods. Now, nutrigenomics is another topic. This is a pretty big topic. You can take an entire college course in nutrigenomics. So this is from Medical News Today. And again, I've pulled out some excerpts, and you can go to the article itself and learn more. Nutrigenomics analyzes how genes and nutrition interact and how diet affects gene expression, essentially how information in a gene becomes a function. This can help researchers understand how diet affects health and how the body responds to food. Nutrigenomics can also help a person understand how certain diseases and illnesses develop in the body and the risk of these diseases developing in the first place. It also helps researchers find new ways to treat and prevent diseases. So that's what it is. Now, let's look at some examples. The food a person eats and supplements they may take can affect gene expression. The expression of different genes as proteins, known as a person's phenotype, can alter or modify how a person digests food, absorbs nutrients, synthesizes nutrients taken from food, or metabolizes food. Basically, what we're talking about is how food affects gene expression. Okay, and I gave you a URL there. You can check more about that. Let's take a look at cultural criteria. We all know that you can go to any number of restaurants and see this ethnic influence, from Mexican restaurants to Italian restaurants to Greek restaurants, Japanese, Chinese, all different kinds of restaurants. And we enjoy that ethnic diversity in our food selection. Of course, we have American fare as well. Place of birth. That will affect your food choice, what you grow up eating, geography and climate, even cultural influences on manners. All of this affects food selection. Let's take a look at some religious criteria involved in food selection. Religions that may adhere to forms of vegetarianism include Buddhism, Hinduism, and Seventh-day Adventist. While Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, discourage alcohol, coffee, and tea. Judaism requires kosher practices, and Islam requires halal practices. Let's talk about kosher foods first. Allowed foods would be fruits, vegetables, grain products, tea, coffee, and dairy products. Kosher animals have to be slaughtered under rabbi supervision, and that would be cattle, sheep, goats, chicken, turkey, goose, and certain ducks. Halal allowed foods are similar to Judaism food laws, Kosher and halal animals slaughtered so that blood is fully drained. That's a requirement. What is not allowed for Judaism in kosher food, not allowed would be blood, mixing of milk and meat, carnivorous animals, fish without scales or fins, underwater mammals, reptiles, and birds of prey. In halal food, which would be in Islam, what is not allowed is blood, pork, carnivorous animals with fangs, land animals without ears, birds with sharp claws, and intoxicants in any form. These are some signs and symbols that you'll see that indicate the food is either kosher or halal. Let's talk about psychological and sociological criteria, specifically bioengineering that affects food selection. We know that attitudes and knowledge vary widely in the population related to GMOs, genetically modified organisms. These are done to either increase production, increase nutrition, or increase crop resistance. However, not all of the public understands or views it that way. Here are some of the products that have been bioengineered. Some of the concerns about GMO foods would include allergies, gene contamination, pesticide residues, religious and cultural concerns, which affect the acceptance or rejection of genetically modified foods. This slide talks about the USDA certified organic seal. This verifies that farms and businesses comply with the USDA organic regulations and allows businesses to sell, label, and represent their products as organic. This slide is taken from a USDA publication, and I have the URL there for you for further review. So there's 3 categories. It can be 100% organic. If it's just labeled organic, we're talking about no less than 95% of certified organic ingredients, excluding salt and water. And then the made with organic must have at least 70% of certified organic ingredients, excluding salt and water. Now let's talk for a moment about processed foods. Processed foods have come under fire, especially ultra-processed foods. To study this, a classification system was developed called the NOVA Food Classification System. This is not an acronym, it's the name of the system. And so you have 4 groups. You have unprocessed or minimally processed food, which would be like whole food. You have processed culinary ingredients, you have processed foods, and then you have the category of ultra processed foods. So I did a little digging on this and found a little bit more information for you. And here you have a spectrum here. It's a increasing level of processing from minimally processed whole foods all the way to the ultra processed foods. Here's some examples. In the unprocessed or minimally processed foods, you have your fresh, dry, or frozen vegetables, or fruit, grains, legumes, meat, fish, eggs, nuts, and seeds. So this is basically whole foods. Some processing could be to remove inedible or unwanted parts. This does not add substances to the original food. Now, Group 2, processed culinary ingredients. Here we have plant oils, animal fats, maple syrup, sugar, honey, and salt, for example. These are substances derived from Group 1 or from nature by processes including pressing, refining, grinding, milling, and drying. Group 3, processed foods, canned or pickled vegetables, meats, fish or fruit, artisanal bread, cheese, salted meats, wine, beer, and cider. These are processing of foods from Group 1 or 2 with the addition of oil, salt, or sugar by means of canning, pickling, smoking, curing, or fermentation. Now we're in Group 4, the ultra-processed foods. Here we have sugar sweetened beverages, sweet and savory packaged snacks, reconstituted meat products, pre prepared frozen dishes, canned or instant soups, chicken nuggets, ice cream, for instance. These are formulations made from a series of processes, including extraction and chemical modification, includes very little intact group 1 foods. So, why is this a concern? Well, one thing is there has been some research that has linked ultra processed foods to higher caloric intake. Here I have for you the article where that image came from and also the abstract from that article. And essentially, they've come to conclude in this study that ultra processed food consumption is consistently associated with an increased risk for weight gain among adults and children and increased risk for adiposity related comorbidities in adults. In a single mechanistic study, consumption of ultra processed foods led to increased energy intake and weight gain relative to whole foods. That might make sense in nutrition, that's common sense almost, but the issue here is that these ultra processed foods tend to be more energy dense, and that's where the problem comes in. Okay. The data suggests recommendations to limit ultra processed food consumption may be beneficial to health, although further mechanistic studies are needed. Okay. There's other research on this. You can look into it more if you would like. Budgetary concerns is another criteria for food selection. Our budgets do determine what we buy, where we buy it, how often we might eat out. Programs aimed at addressing food insecurity include SNAP, WIC, National School Lunch Program, and food banks. There's one other psychological or sociological criteria that I want to mention that's not listed here, and that would be food selection based on actual psychological or emotional factors within the individual, such as emotional eating, eating disorders, and those types of concerns. That's beyond the scope of this lecture, but it is important to mention. So, in summary, we have described how the 5 sensory criteria influence food selection. We've recalled the nutritional criteria that play a role in food choices. We've listed several cultural aspects that can affect food intake. We have compared food choices based on religion. We've listed psychological and sociological factors contributing to food choices, and we've evaluated various budgetary concerns that can influence a person's diet. So this concludes the lesson on food selection. Thank you so much for your attention.